The morning sun blazed over the Afghan mountains as Captain Sarah Mitchell adjusted her helmet inside the cockpit of her A-10 Thunderbolt aircraft. She had been flying combat missions for 3 years, but today felt different. The radio chatter was more intense, and the mission briefing had been unusually detailed. Down below, in the rocky terrain of Helmand Province, 381 Navy SEALs from multiple teams were conducting the largest special operations mission of the war. Their target was a heavily fortified Taliban compound that intelligence suggested housed high-value targets and a massive weapons cache. The operation, codenamed Desert Storm, had been planned for months. Team Leader Commander Jake Rodriguez led the first wave of SEALs as they moved through the narrow canyon toward their objective. The terrain was perfect for an ambush, with high rocky walls on both sides and limited escape routes. Rodriguez felt uneasy, but pushed forward, trusting in his team's training and preparation. The SEALs had been inserted by helicopter under cover of darkness, landing several miles from the target compound. They moved in small teams, using night vision and advanced communication equipment to coordinate their advance. Everything seemed to be going according to plan until the first shots rang out. What the intelligence reports had failed to mention was that the Taliban had been expecting them. Over 2,000 enemy fighters had been positioned throughout the canyon and surrounding hills, turning the entire area into a killing field. The moment the SEALs entered the narrow pass, machine gun fire erupted from every direction. Rodriguez immediately called for his teams to take cover behind the scattered boulders, but the enemy had positioned themselves perfectly. Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, and rocket-propelled grenades exploded nearby, sending debris flying through the air. The noise was deafening, and the smell of gunpowder filled the canyon. Within minutes, it became clear that the SEALs were completely surrounded. Radio communications crackled with urgent calls for assistance as team leaders tried to coordinate their positions while under heavy fire. Several SEALs had already been wounded, and their ammunition was being depleted rapidly. The enemy had clearly studied American tactics and had prepared for exactly this type of operation. They had blocked all escape routes and positioned snipers on the high ground to prevent any movement. The SEALs found themselves trapped in what military strategists would later call a perfect kill zone. As the firefight intensified, Rodriguez realized that conventional rescue operations would be impossible. The terrain made it difficult for helicopters to land, and ground reinforcements would take hours to arrive. The Taliban fighters seemed endless, replacing their casualties with fresh fighters who knew the terrain intimately. The situation became more desperate by the hour. Medical supplies were running low, and several SEALs were critically wounded and needed immediate evacuation. The enemy continued to press their advantage, moving closer to the SEAL positions and increasing the intensity of their attacks. Command headquarters received the distress calls and immediately began coordinating rescue operations. However, every option seemed impossible due to the terrain and the overwhelming number of enemy forces. Traditional air support would risk hitting the trapped SEALs, and ground forces couldn't reach them in time. Meanwhile, Sarah Mitchell had been monitoring the emergency communications from her position high above the battlefield. As an A-10 pilot, she was trained for close air support missions, but this situation was unlike anything she had encountered before. The enemy forces were too close to the friendly troops for standard bombing runs. The canyon echoed with the sounds of continuous gunfire as both sides settled into what appeared to be a prolonged battle. The SEALs used their training to maximize their defensive positions, but they were outnumbered more than 5-1, and their situation was becoming more critical with each passing hour. As night approached, the reality of the situation became clear to everyone involved. The 381 Navy SEALs were trapped in enemy territory with no clear way out, facing an enemy force that seemed determined to eliminate them completely. The rescue mission that was supposed to last a few hours had turned into a fight for survival that would test the limits of American military capability and courage. Captain Sarah Mitchell circled high above the battlefield in her A-10, watching the desperate situation unfold below. Through her targeting systems, she could see the muzzle flashes from enemy positions surrounding the trapped SEALs. The radio communications painted a grim picture of wounded soldiers and dwindling ammunition supplies. The standard rules of engagement prohibited close air support when enemy and friendly forces were within 200 meters of each other. In this canyon, the Taliban fighters were sometimes less than 50 meters from SEAL positions. Any mistake could result in friendly fire casualties, something that would end her career and haunt her forever. Ground control repeatedly denied her requests for permission to engage, citing the extreme risk to friendly forces. Military doctrine was clear about these situations, but doctrine hadn't anticipated anything like this. The SEALs were facing annihilation while she flew overhead with enough firepower to change everything. Down in the canyon, the situation continued to deteriorate. Commander Rodriguez had lost radio contact with 3 of his teams, and medical supplies were completely exhausted. The wounded SEALs were being treated with torn clothing and whatever materials could be found among the rocks. The Taliban fighters had organized themselves into waves, attacking from different directions to prevent the SEALs from establishing effective defensive positions. They used the terrain expertly, appearing from behind rocks to fire quick bursts before disappearing again. The psychological pressure was enormous, as the constant threat made rest impossible. Young Petty Officer Marcus Thompson, only 22 years old and on his first deployment, found himself separated from his team during a particularly intense enemy assault. He had taken refuge behind a large boulder, but enemy fighters were closing in on his position. His radio was damaged, and he couldn't call for help. Sarah Mitchell watched through her aircraft's cameras as individual SEALs fought desperately against overwhelming odds. She could see Thompson's isolated position and the enemy fighters moving toward him. Her hands gripped the flight controls tighter as she realized that following orders meant watching good soldiers die. The A-10 Thunderbolt was specifically designed for close air support missions. Its 30mm cannon was incredibly accurate, and Sarah had trained extensively on precision targeting. She knew she could eliminate the enemy positions threatening the SEALs, but military regulations explicitly forbade the action. As the hours passed, the radio communications became increasingly desperate. Medical evacuation was impossible due to the enemy fire, and several SEALs were critically wounded. The Taliban seemed content to wait, knowing that time was on their side as the Americans ran out of ammunition and medical supplies. Sarah made multiple requests to higher command for permission to engage, each time being denied due to the proximity of friendly forces. She explained that the SEALs would be overrun within hours without air support, but the response remained the same. The risk of friendly fire was too great. The breaking point came when she heard Rodriguez's voice over the radio, calmly reporting that his position was about to be overrun. He wasn't asking for rescue anymore. He was simply updating command on the situation as enemy fighters moved in for what appeared to be the final assault. Sarah realized that following orders would mean watching 381 of America's elite warriors die in a foreign canyon while she flew overhead with the power to save them. The weight of that knowledge became unbearable as she listened to the increasingly desperate communications from the ground. She thought about her training, her oath as an officer, and the consequences of disobeying direct orders. Military law was clear about insubordination, especially during combat operations. Her career would be over, and she could face court-martial and imprisonment. But she also thought about the families of the men trapped below, the wives and children who were waiting for their heroes to come home. These weren't just soldiers. They were fathers, sons, and brothers who had volunteered to serve their country in its most dangerous missions. The decision crystallized in her mind as she watched enemy fighters positioning themselves for what appeared to be a coordinated final assault on the SEAL positions. Military regulations were written to prevent friendly fire casualties, but in this case, following those regulations guaranteed friendly casualties. Sarah adjusted her flight path and began her descent toward the canyon. She switched her radio to a frequency that would reach the ground troops directly, bypassing the command structure that had repeatedly denied her permission to engage. Her voice was calm and professional as she made contact with Rodriguez. She informed the SEAL commander that she was preparing to provide close air support, despite not having official authorization. Rodriguez understood the implications immediately. This pilot was risking everything to save his men. The relief in his voice was evident as he began coordinating with her to identify target priorities. The A-10's targeting systems locked onto the enemy positions as Sarah prepared for the most important mission of her military career. She knew that once she fired the first shot, there would be no turning back. Her career, her freedom, and her future were all on the line, but 381 American lives hung in the balance. Sarah Mitchell's A-10 Thunderbolt descended through the Afghan sky like a guardian angel as she prepared for the most dangerous close air support mission ever attempted. Her targeting computer showed dozens of enemy positions, some less than 30 meters from friendly forces. One mistake would mean killing the very soldiers she was trying to save. The 30mm cannon of the A-10 was designed for precision, but at these distances, precision meant threading the needle between life and death. Sarah's years of training and natural flying ability would be tested beyond anything she had experienced in combat or simulation. Commander Rodriguez coordinated with Sarah from his position behind the rocks, using laser designators to mark the most critical enemy positions. The communication had to be perfect, as any confusion could result in disaster. Rodriguez trusted this unknown pilot with the lives of his men, knowing she was risking everything to save them. The first burst from the A-10's cannon was like thunder rolling through the canyon. Sarah's shots were perfectly placed, eliminating a machine gun position that had been pinning down an entire SEAL team. The psychological effect on the Taliban fighters was immediate, as they realized they were now facing the most feared ground attack aircraft in the American arsenal. Enemy fighters who had felt confident in their superior numbers suddenly found themselves exposed to devastating air power. The A-10's cannon could penetrate their cover and eliminate multiple targets with each pass. Sarah worked methodically, targeting the positions that posed the greatest threat to the trapped SEALs. The canyon filled with smoke and dust as explosion after explosion rocked the enemy positions. Taliban fighters who had been closing in on SEAL locations suddenly found themselves retreating to avoid the deadly accurate fire from above. The tide of battle was shifting dramatically. Young Marcus Thompson, who had been isolated and surrounded, suddenly found his position clear as Sarah eliminated the enemy fighters who had been advancing on him. He was able to rejoin his team and provide covering fire for other SEALs who were moving to better positions. Sarah's fuel was running low, but she continued her attacks with surgical precision. Each pass brought her lower into the canyon, increasing her accuracy but also making her aircraft more vulnerable to enemy fire. Anti-aircraft weapons began firing at her position, filling the sky with deadly projectiles. The SEAL medics were finally able to reach the wounded and begin proper treatment as enemy pressure decreased. Medical evacuation helicopters could now approach the area, though Sarah had to continue providing cover to ensure their safe landing and departure. Rodriguez coordinated the evacuation of the most critically wounded SEALs, while Sarah maintained her protective fire overhead. Her ammunition was nearly exhausted, but she continued to make passes over the canyon to keep enemy fighters pinned down and unable to interfere with the rescue operations. The first helicopter lifted off with wounded SEALs just as Sarah's ammunition ran out completely. She had expended every round in a display of flying skill that would be studied in military academies for years to come. Not a single friendly fire casualty had occurred despite the extremely close proximity of enemy and friendly forces. With no ammunition remaining, Sarah used her aircraft as a psychological weapon, making low passes over enemy positions to keep them suppressed while additional rescue helicopters arrived. The Taliban fighters, having witnessed the devastating effectiveness of her previous attacks, remained hidden rather than risk exposure. One by one, the trapped SEAL teams were evacuated from the canyon. The mission that was supposed to last a few hours had stretched into a nightmare that tested the limits of military capability and human courage. Sarah's unauthorized intervention had turned certain defeat into successful rescue. As the last helicopter lifted off with the final group of SEALs, Sarah turned her aircraft toward the base, knowing that her military career was effectively over. She had disobeyed direct orders from superior officers and violated established rules of engagement. Court-martial proceedings would begin immediately upon her return. The debriefing was intense, with senior officers demanding explanations for her unauthorized actions. Sarah accepted full responsibility for her decisions, making no excuses and offering no justification beyond her belief that American lives were more valuable than military regulations. The 381 Navy SEALs who had been trapped in the canyon were all successfully evacuated. Thanks to Sarah's intervention, casualties were limited to treatable wounds rather than the massive loss of life that had seemed inevitable. Every SEAL who had been in that canyon owed his life to the courage of one Air Force pilot. The military justice system moved quickly, and Sarah faced charges of insubordination, disobeying lawful orders, and unauthorized use of military weapons. The potential penalties included dismissal from service, loss of all benefits, and possible imprisonment. Her military career, which had been exemplary up to that point, was destroyed. However, the story of her heroic actions spread throughout the military community and eventually reached the public. The families of the rescued SEALs organized a support campaign, arguing that Sarah deserved recognition rather than punishment for her life-saving actions. The case became a national debate about military regulations versus moral courage. Legal experts argued both sides, with some maintaining that military discipline required strict adherence to orders, while others contended that saving 381 lives justified breaking regulations. Sarah Mitchell faced an uncertain future, knowing that her actions had saved hundreds of lives, but had also ended her military career. She had made the ultimate sacrifice, trading her professional future for the lives of fellow service members. The woman who had risked everything to save 381 Navy SEALs had become a symbol of the moral courage that defines the best of military service, regardless of the personal consequences she faced.